Good morning, guys. Welcome to another day of History with Casey. So, yesterday you guys were looking at the ways that the Mongols conquered, both why they conquered and how they conquered. Today we want to look at the impact that the Mongols had on the places that they conquered. So, to start us off for today, I wanted to first begin by doing a little bit of a recap of what you guys learned yesterday to make sure everything was clear and to kind of fill in on some things that I thought were worth discussing a little bit more deeply. And then I also wanted to go into some things about the impact that the Mongols had on the places they conquered, which I think will complement nicely with what you guys are going to be reading today when it comes to the worksheet on the impact of the Mongol conquests, as well as for the AP classes, the European relations with the Mongols documents. Tomorrow, you guys will also be learning about Marco Polo and Kublai Khan, the Mongol ruler of Han China. So this will hopefully lead into that as well and serve as an introduction for both of those lessons. All right, so let's get started. So looking back to the worksheet, the first thing it talked about was why they conquered, what motivated them to conquer. And a lot of it was about environment and geography. So remember, the Mongols are a nomadic pastoral people. They rely on the availability of grass, and that is grass that is naturally occurring, wildly growing. They are not farmers. They do not plant that grass. So the grass is not crops. Very often when kids do this worksheet, they will say that the Mongols' crops were failing. That is not the case because they did not grow crops. They simply took their animals to grassy pastures, right? Hence the term pastoral nomads, grassy pastures or grasslands, and allowed the animals to graze or feed on that grass. If the grass was not available, then they needed to go somewhere else. So when the environment started shifting, when the climate in the region started changing, that pushed them, that's considered a push factor in migration, to expand out of their area. So another reason was the reliance on trade with China. Because they are a pastoral nomadic people, they are essentially full-time cowboys, right? They herd their animals from place to place. There's only certain resources that they have access to. They have access to meat and milk and skins from their animals, but there's a lot of things they don't have out on the plains, out on the grasslands, the steppe lands. They don't have access to wood. They certainly don't have access to crops, as we said. So when they are looking for grain, when they are looking for specialized goods, because living a pastoral nomadic lifestyle does not lend itself to a high degree of job specialization like you would see in some of these settled, quote-unquote, more civilized areas. So when they need access to certain trade goods, like manufactured products and agricultural products, they really rely for their existence on their relationships with those settled peoples, in this case China. And when the relationship between the nomads, such as the Mongols, and the Chinese, the settled peoples, when that relationship soured, when there becomes a conflict there where they refuse to trade with them, they cut them off from trade. The Mongols say, well, you're really leaving us with only one other option. We're going to have to attack you and take the things that we need because we need them. We can't survive without them. So we're going to get them one way or another, and that also leads them to conquer. Now, the second part of it was, how were they able to conquer? Why were they so successful? So there were kind of two ways of looking at this. One way that is very popular is to look at their technological advances. And one technological, and we're using the word technology broadly here, one technological advance that they had was a combination of three things. One, they had the horse, right? We know that obviously by this time horses are fairly widespread, but we've looked at nomadic steppe peoples for a very long time. And of course, the one thing I'm sure you all associate with nomadic steppe peoples is me running around the classroom like I'm riding a horse, firing invisible arrows and yelling, pew, 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 pew. I wish I could do that for you today. But of course, while the horse provides that speed and mobility that was so important for the military advantage of steppe peoples over their settled counterparts, it's not just the horse, right? It's also the bow. So what is going on with the Mongol bow? So there's two words that you should associate with the Mongol bow. One is a recurve bow. So unlike some European bows that are basically just one long piece and they curve back as a bow does, the recurve bow, it curves back, but then it also curves forward again. That's why it's called recurve. And you can see in the image the way that it is strung. When it's unstrung, it's very, very twisted the other way, and it has to be pulled back heavily to be strung. So that recurve, that extra curve backward, creates a lot more tension, a lot more force on the bow. The second word that you can associate with the Mongol bows is a composite bow. Composite means it's made of different materials. So unlike some other bows in the world or simpler bows that were just one long piece of wood, the Mongol bows were actually multiple different materials that were combined together in a composite, using sinew, which is animal muscle tissue, using bone, using horn. And again, these are all materials that the Mongols, as nomadic pastoral people, would have had more access to than something like wood. And having those materials together creates a stronger overall bow, and more power can be packed into a small weapon, which is what the Mongols needed on horseback. You couldn't have a big bow for that. And finally, the third piece, and this is the part that people often forget, in addition to having the horse and having the bow, is the stirrup, which is that piece that you put your foot into. And that allows you to have stability while you're riding the horse. Because if you're flying back and forth, bouncing in your seat, you're not going to be able to fire a bow. So since I can't run around the room for you guys today, I figured I'll do something maybe even better. So check this out. And you'll notice as she's riding, she's balancing herself, she's securing herself because she has her feet in the stirrups. You see that right there? And that gives her the stability to fire accurately at the targets. I'll include a link for this video so you can learn more about this and also how the bows were made. But while the Mongols did have this advantage and it made them fierce warriors, this advantage was not something that they themselves invented. Other steppe peoples had similar things, so why were they so successful? So as John Green argued as well, some of this at least comes down to so-called great man history, the individual Genghis Khan or Chinggis Khan. Sometimes I split the difference and just say Genghis Khan. You guys watched a video about him, so I'm not going to go into his whole background of his history. The term Genghis Khan or Genghis Khan means universal ruler. So Khan means ruler. You'll see most of the Mongol rulers have Khan in their name. But one thing that I think that was interesting that he did was he used meritocracy, which we've talked about a lot in the context of China with the civil service exams, the idea of promoting people based on merit, based on their qualifications, their quality, not just some connections that they have or a status that they're hereditarily born into. So that meant that the people he was including in his leadership were the most qualified and were going to do the best job. And he also used sort of a populism, and we've seen successful leaders, including military leaders, people like Julius Caesar and Augustus, use this idea of being one of the people, doing things to provide support for the people to get them on your side. He kind of does this in a different way. He brought the lower classes of the people he conquered, people who may have been unhappy under the rule of the previous rulers, and he took them and he brought them into his own tribe. He essentially made these people part of the Mongols, and this is something that we actually see is also popular among nomadic steppe confederations, that it's not that you're becoming a Mongol ethnically, but you are becoming a Mongol by membership. You're joining the club, so to speak, and anybody that they conquer, anybody that they incorporate into their empire can become a Mongol in that way. So this is how the Mongols are going to go from this tiny little population in the steppe lands to this massive empire in such a short amount of time. Okay, so that was kind of long for like a recap and a review and a clarification of some things, but I really love the Mongols, as you guys know. So now I want to just take a look at the impact that the Mongols had on the places they conquered. I'll kind of do an overview of that, and then you guys can dig a little deeper as you look at the documents in the impact of the Mongol conquests, and for the AP classes, the European relations with the Mongols, and then tomorrow you'll continue that further when you go into the story of Marco Polo and the things that he learned during his time serving in Mongol China. Okay, so under the leadership of Genghis Khan, the Mongols conquered the majority of the Eurasian steppe, and I use that term intentionally because It's one thing for the Mongols to conquer regions that are geographically very similar to their own, culturally very similar to their own semi-nomadic steppe areas. It's a little bit more of a challenge when they go beyond that area. So we're going to get into that a little bit. So after Genghis's death, his sons and his grandsons continued the conquests. One notable conquest is the conquest of the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, as you guys know, the Abbasid Caliphate was already in something of a decline. It was certainly not this enormous empire spanning from east to west that it had been in its early days. In particular, we saw the Fatimid Caliphate expand out of North Africa and take over a lot of the land that the Abbasids once ruled. And then we saw the Abbasids call on the Seljuk Turks as mercenaries to support them, and the Seljuks only ended up conquering the Abbasids themselves. But one thing that was unique and that's different from this situation is that the Seljuks ruled over the Abbasid Caliphate, but they did not get rid of the Abbasid Caliphate. They did not remove the Caliph from power. They only turned him into a puppet ruler of the Seljuks. So they kept up the appearances of the Abbasid Caliphate. That was not the case with the Mongols. When the Mongols came in 1258, they sacked Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, this center of translation and learning that made Baghdad not just a great city, but what was described as one of the two lights of the Muslim world alongside Cordoba. This incredible center of the Islamic Golden Age, and they really brought it to its knees. The libraries, mosques were destroyed. Some of the farmland was actually turned into grazing land for the animals in a kind of short-sighted attempt by the Mongols to create more food for their horses, later only realizing that this was now going to deplete the food resources for the population. The caliph was killed, the population was massacred, the city was left in ruins. And eventually, the city recovered. There is still a city of Baghdad, of course, today. It's the capital of Iraq. But it was never this amazing center of culture that it had once been. So over time, as we've seen before, we saw this with Alexander the Great. The Mongol Khanate, this huge empire, and Khanate is the term we use for an area ruled by a Khan. So it divided into pieces. They still had relations with each other and communication and dealings, but eventually they did break up into separate states. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, in the central steppe regions, the Il Khanate in Persia, which extended all the way to the Indus Valley and into parts of Central Asia, the Khanate of the Golden Horde, which was the one that's most associated with Russia in the western steppe lands going into and towards Europe, and then of course the Great Khanate, which was considered the main remaining portion of the Mongol Empire, and that was also the Yuan dynasty of China. So when we look at this map just with the colors, we might be impressed to see how much area they conquered, but we also want to take a look at the areas they didn't conquer and think about why that might have been. So you'll notice on this map, India was not conquered by the Mongols. It was under the Delhi Sultanates, another Turkic peoples. They eventually did conquer the Song Empire, as you can see, but it took a little bit longer for them to be able to do that. They did not conquer Arabia. They did not conquer Mamluk Egypt. And if we look back to the previous map, they only went so far into Europe, and they weren't successful in conquering the entirety of the European landmass. So why was that? So one really important reason was geography. When they were expanding across the steppe regions, they encountered a geography that was very similar to what they had in Mongolia. And so their whole system of conquest based on horses, based on bows, that was very well suited to conquering further steppe areas. But when they start expanding into areas that are different, either in terms of the environment or in terms of what the populations there are able to create, then it's going to be a little bit more difficult. So one very important example is the example of Mamluk Egypt. Now, we looked the other day at Egypt, and right before the Mongol conquest, we saw that it was controlled by the Ayyubid Sultanate, which was the state that was set up by Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, or Saladin, the famous crusading leader. By the time the Mongols show up in the Middle East and Egypt, that area, the area of Egypt, but also the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, what is considered the Holy Land, basically, was actually now under the control not of the Ayyubids, but of the Mamluks. The Mamluks, who don't get enough attention, honestly, they were slave soldiers. The word Mamluk actually meant slave soldier. And they were slave soldiers in the Ayyubid Sultanate who actually rose up and took over the power of the government. It was very common in the Middle East for slave soldiers to even have high positions of authority and prestige. And so they ended up taking control of the state and creating the Mamluk Sultanate. And now the Mongols are coming in and trying to invade. But you have to remember, when we come into the Middle East and Egypt, this is not the same geography that they are used to. This is not that grassy steppe land. It's a much drier climate. It's a much more difficult area for horses in certain areas, and they're certainly not going to have access to readily available grass. And so that difference in the geography that they're going to encounter, there's a famous battle, the Battle of Ain Jalut, which takes place in, not actually in Egypt, but in Eastern Mediterranean. It is a very difficult geography for them. So that puts them at a disadvantage there that they hadn't faced before. Another example is when we look at China. China had very strongly built fortifications, walls, and towers that prevented the Mongols from just simply riding through and taking over an area. They couldn't just ride their horses right up a wall. And so this required them to get creative and use some ingenuity. And this was actually in the documents from yesterday when you guys read about Mongol ingenuity, that they actually brought on Chinese experts to help them figure out how can we overcome the challenge of the Chinese well-built fortifications, right? This is a major civilized, settled agricultural state. They have the resources to build these border protections, these walls. How can we get beyond that? And so we see something very similar to what we saw in Europe, where Europe became, in defense of the Vikings, started to build up their fortifications. China is building up its fortifications, or had already done so. The Mongols, though, rather than just giving up, they brought on Chinese experts to teach them how they could beat those Chinese defenses. And they started to build catapults to attack the walls and break them down. And so they were successful in eventually being able to do this. And I know I kind of jumped ahead to innovation, so let's go back to politics, because what was going on in Europe? Why did the Mongols not succeed at completely taking over Europe? Well, one thing that did happen, and just an event of history, is that as the Mongols were about to take over Europe in the north, and then further south, they were about to take over Egypt, the Great Khan, the leader of the entire Mongol Empire, died. And because of that, that required the top leadership of the Mongols from all across this wide and expanding Mongol Empire to actually return back to Mongolia to deal with the death of their leader and to have the Kurultai, the election, to choose a new leader. When all the leadership leaves from these really important and pivotal battles and expansions, they're not going to be so successful because they're not as well led. And so that further expansion into Central Europe and the expansion into Mamluk Egypt both suffered, not just because the geography was different, which it was, but also because of political reasons. The leadership just happened to not be there at that time, and that put them at a disadvantage. Another challenge or factor that the Mongols encountered was making that transition from being leaders of a pastoral nomadic warrior confederation to being the rulers of these really heavily developed settled civilizations that they had come to conquer. So there's a famous quote from Yelu Chukai where he was said to have told Ogadai Khan, "You can conquer an empire on horseback, but you cannot rule it on horseback." So essentially what we can take from this is that those skills and those qualities that made you so successful at conquering those nomadic ways, that maybe won't be as useful when you actually need to sit down and start running things. And we talked about this a lot in your last essays, and we made the comparison with Alexander the Great, that it's not enough to just be good at conquering. You can't just expand, you also have to consolidate. And those consolidation skills and techniques that we learned about there are all the hallmarks of the settled agricultural civilizations. So the Mongols have to figure out how to balance that nomadic style and their nomadic heritage with the needs of running a agricultural settled state. So some of the common themes in Mongol rule is that they adopted the local cultural norms of the places they had conquered. One exception to this is that the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia stayed much truer to its Mongolian nomadic steppe routes. Why? Because the area they conquered, that they ruled, was also on the steppe. And so those same skills and qualities applied there just the same as they did back in the Mongol homeland. But for many of the other places, to a certain extent Russia, though much of the Golden Horde's territory was steppe as well, but certainly the Il Khanate in Persia and the Yuan dynasty in China, or the Great Khanate, they really had to adopt the local ways. So they ruled in the style of the settled rulers. In the Persians, they ruled the way that Muslim rulers ruled. In China, they ruled like Confucian Chinese rulers. They were very open to having local leaders stay in power as long as they always acknowledged Mongol authority. They said, you know how to do this, you know how to run things, we don't want to get in your way, and we'll let you continue to do that. That was a very nomadic thing, because the nomadic peoples generally didn't always have the resources to become super micromanagement when it came to ruling. They were forced usually to allow people to run things their way, and they found that that actually worked out fairly well, and so they continued that policy even when their power grew. We actually saw something very similar all the way back with the Achaemenid Persians, and that they drew on their own nomadic roots as Indo-Europeans and applied that in a similar way to be more flexible, more tolerant. The Mongols also used experts from the settled peoples as administrators and advisors, and we saw that, and we see that in the documents as well. They were happy and excited to move people around from different regions. If they saw somebody from the Middle East had a particular skill that would be useful in China, they brought them there. If they saw somebody in China had a skill that would be useful in Russia, they brought them there, so that there was a real conscious effort and an intentional effort to have cultural diffusion, not just let it happen naturally, but to really push that forward. They also often converted to the local religions. Many of them adopted Islam in Central Asia and in the Middle East because that was the religion of the people there. In China, Buddhism was, if not converted to, at least patronized and supported. And Confucianism, certainly as a philosophy, was embraced to a certain extent by the Mongol rulers. So to show the people there that, hey, we're like you, we are one of you, we are cool with the stuff that you are into. And they were very tolerant of all religions because, like we've seen before, when you're tolerant, it's easier to rule the people. If you try to enforce your will on them, then they resist. If you are flexible, then they are more likely to just go with the flow. So one way we can summarize this is that we can understand that they were brutal and violent as conquerors, but tolerant as rulers. So I like to say, as conquerors, they're cruel, but as rulers, they're cool. Another way to think of it is, as conquerors, they kill, but as rulers, they chill. Another major impact of the Mongol conquests was this period of what we can call a Pax Mongolica, drawing on that term of the Pax Romana. We saw a similar thing during the large expansion of the caliphates, which I sometimes would call the Pax Islamica, right? This idea that if you have a lot of area under the rule of one empire, then it creates safety because there's not the fear that other invaders will be crossing borders to fight, and organization because that one state is controlling everything, and they can allow for safer trade and just safer life in general. As we're finding out in times of danger, in times of problems outside, the economy slows down because it's not necessarily so safe to be out and about doing your business, right? That could be due to the spread of disease, as we're seeing right now in this moment, but it could also be due to war and conflict, which was generally more often the case in the pre-modern world. And so having all of that land under one ruler allowed it to be stable and safe so that people could conduct business and move about safely without having fear hanging over their heads. And so this actually brings back the Silk Road, which had kind of gone into decline. And of course, as we said, with that increase in trade and that really intentional effort to share between cultures, we see new ideas, new technologies spreading, especially those in China and the Middle East, and many of that reaching Europe during this time period. So things like gunpowder, right? Paper, which we had already seen reach the Middle East, and now it's expanding further into Europe. Block printing, which is going to make its way into Europe. Paper money will make its way from China. Gunpowder will not just reach Europe, but also the Middle East, and we'll see a number of gunpowder empires that will be expanding during this unit as a result of the Mongol conquests. Knowledge is spreading, right? Math, medicine, astronomy that's coming out of the Middle East is reaching new places. Knowledge of geography. The Mongols, as you can see in this image, they had some of the most accurate maps in the world, and using their information, others were able to create more accurate maps. That thing you see in the corner is like an early sort of gun or gunpowder based weapon. So the Mongols really had just a tremendous impact on the world as we know it today. One area of the Mongol empires that I want to particularly focus on right here at the end is China. So we know that right before this we had Song China. It was only in the south. The northern part of China had been conquered by nomadic peoples, not the Mongols, but other nomadic peoples. So those are the areas that the Mongols are going to conquer more immediately. And Song China is going to be the real holdout for a while. And like we said, they're going to use their technology and their innovation and their communication with other peoples to kind of eventually beat the Song Chinese and take over all of China. And this is going to create the Yuan dynasty, which, as you can see from the map, was enormous because it not only included all of what had been China at the time, but even additional conquests by the Mongols further west, and of course the areas to the north, all that steppe region to the north that they had conquered, all became part of this enormous territory of Yuan China. And we can see on the list of dynasties that we see it listed there right after the Song, and the next will be the Ming. So one thing that the Mongols did was, and this was under the rule of Kublai Khan, one of the grandsons of Genghis Khan or Genghis Khan, not only did he maintain many of the nomadic ways and the nomadic culture of the Mongols, but he also embraced a lot of Chinese culture and Chinese style of rule. And one of the documents and worksheets that you guys are going to see tomorrow is looking at how Kublai Khan attempted to his best effort to balance between the Mongol influence and the Chinese influence in his empire. And he received criticism from both sides, right? The Mongols said he wasn't Mongol enough. The Chinese said he wasn't Chinese enough, but he tried to find a balance, and I'll let you decide whether you think he did a good job at that. Another person that we want to think about in this story is a man named Marco. Hopefully you said it, Marco Polo. We talked about Ibn Battuta, the much better alternative, in my opinion, for the pool game, but that's up to you. But Marco Polo was an incredible person as well. He was a traveler, and he went all throughout many parts of the world. But a lot of his traveling was actually on behalf of the Mongol Khanate in China under the rule of Kublai Khan. He worked for the government. And so a lot of what he learned from his work there. So you guys will also get a chance to look at some of Marco Polo's writings tomorrow and see what he was able to observe about the lands under Mongol rule. And that will also help you to come to a conclusion for yourself about whether the Mongols were good rulers and whether Kublai Khan in particular did a good job as a ruler of China. All right, so that is it for today, guys. I wish you the very, very best. Stay safe, wash your hands, don't touch your face, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Oh, and if I do find a video of me riding on a chair, pretending it's a horse, and shooting a bow and screaming, pew, 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 I will do my best to post that on the Instagram. So guys, if you are not already following me on Instagram and you do Instagram, please check it out. It's at Global Khan. Now you get the reference. Not the Genghis Khan, not the Universal Khan or Universal ruler, but the ruler of global, because I'm the ruler of global history, or at least that's the goal. So please check that out, guys. I'll also post in stories a video on a tutorial for Mongolian throat singing. So for those of you guys who have heard me try my weak attempt at throat singing, maybe we can all practice during this time at home, and when we come back to school, we'll all be professional throat singers. So I look forward to that, guys. Have a great rest of your day. Peace out.